Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you again. Miss Peggy's story time, and we're in chapter 5 of The Horse and His Boy. And what an exciting chapter number 4 was, wasn't it? And we have discovered that poor old Shasta has been captured, you might say, by the Narnians who think that he's the long lost Prince Corrin, and no amount of reasons came to his mind that he should tell them exactly who he was. So he was lying on a sofa drinking lovely soft iced drinks and whatnot. But he could tell that King Edmund and Queen Susan were really worried about something. And that was how we ended the chapter yesterday. And this chapter, number 5, is called Prince Corrin. So we know it's going to be exciting. Chapter 5. "My dear sister, and my very good lady," said King Edmund, "you must now show your courage, for I tell you plainly that we are in no small danger." "What is it, Edmund?" said the queen. "It is this," said Edmund. "I do not think we will find it easy to leave Tashbaan. While the prince had hopes that you would take him, we were honored guests. But by the lion's mane, I think that as soon as he hears your flat denial, we shall be no better than prisoners." One of the dwarfs gave a low whistle. "I warned your majesties, I warned you," said Sallopad the raven. "Easily in, but not easily out," as the lobster said to the lobster pot. "I have been with the prince this morning," continued Edmund. "He is little used, more's the pity, to having his will crossed. And he is very chafed at your long delays and your doubtful answers. This morning he pressed very hard to know your mind. I put it aside, meaning at the same time to diminish his hope with some light common jests about women's fancies, and hinted that his suit for your hand was likely to go cold. But he grew angry and very dangerous. There was a sort of threatening, though still veiled, under a show of courtesy, but threatening nonetheless in every word that he spoke. Yes, said Tumnus, and when I supped with the Grand Vizier last night, it was the same. He asked me how I liked Tashbaan, and for I could not tell him that I hated every stone of it, and I would not lie, I told him that now, when high summer was coming on, my heart had turned to the cool woods and the sunny slopes of Narnia. He gave a smile that meant no good, and said, There is nothing to prevent you from dancing there again, little Goatfoot, always provided you leave your bride in exchange for our prince. Do you mean that he would take me as his wife by force? Said Susan. That is my fear, said Edmund. Wife or slave, whichever is worse. But how can he? Does the Tisroc think that our brother, the High King, would suffer such an outrage? Sire, said Peredan to the king, they would not be so mad. Surely they think that there are swords and spears in Narnia. Alas, said Edmund, my guess is that the Tisroc has very small fear of Narnia. We are a little country. All little lands on the borders of a great empire were always hateful to the lords of the great empire. He longs to blot them out, gobble them up. When he first allowed the prince to come to Cair Paravel as your lover, my sister, it may be that he was only seeking an occasion to fight against us. Most likely he hopes to take both Narnia and Archenland in one big bite. Let him try, said the second dwarf. As the sea, we are as big as he is, and if he assaults us by land, he has the desert to cross. True, friend, but the desert is the desert, a sure defense. What does Sallopad say? I know the desert well, said the raven, for I have flown above it far and wide in my younger days. And you may be sure that Shasta pricked up his ears at that. And this is certain, that if the Tisroc goes by the great oasis, he can never lead a great army through to Archenland. For though they could reach the oasis by the end of their first day's march, the springs there would be too little for the thirst of all their soldiers and their beasts. But there is another way. Shasta listened more attentively still. He would find that way, said the raven, He who would find that way, said the raven, must start from the tombs of the ancient kings and ride northwest so that the double peak of Mount Pyre is always straight ahead of him. And so, in a day's riding or a little more, he will come to the head of a stony valley, which is so narrow that a man might be within a few hundred yards of it 1,000 times and never know that it was there. And looking down this valley, he will see neither grass nor water or anything else good. But if he rides down it, he will come to a river, and he can ride by the water all the way to Archenland. And do the Calormenes know of this western way? Asked the queen. Friends, friends, said Edmund, what is the use of all this talk? We're not asking whether Narnia or Calormen would win if a war arose between them. We're asking how to save the honor of our queen and our own lives out of this devilish city. For though my brother, Peter the High King, defeated the Tisroc 12 times over, yet long before that day our throats would be cut and our queen would be the wife, or more likely the slave, of this prince. We have our weapons, king, said the first dwarf, and this is a reasonably defensive house we're staying in. As to that, said the king, I do not doubt that every one of us would sell our lives dearly at the gate, and they would not come at the queen but over our dead bodies, yet we would really be rats fighting in a trap when all's said and done. Very true, croaked the raven. These last stands in a house make for good stories, but nothing ever comes of them. After their first repulses, the enemy always sets the house on fire. I am the cause of all this, burst out Susan, bursting into tears. Oh, if only I had never left Cape Paravel. Our last happy day was before those ambassadors came from Calormen. The moles were planting an orchard for us. Oh! And she buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Courage, Sue, courage, said Edmund. Remember, but what is the matter with you, Mr. Tumnus? For the fawn was holding both his horns with his hands as if he were trying to keep his head on, and he was writhing to and fro as if he had a pain inside. Don't speak to me, he said. I'm thinking, so that I can hardly breathe. Wait, just wait. There was a moment's puzzled silence, and then the fawn looked up, drew a deep, long breath, mopped his forehead, and said, The only difficulty is how to get down to our ship, with some stores too, without being seen and stopped. Yes, said a dwarf dryly, just as a beggar's only difficulty about riding is that he has no horse. Wait, said Mr. Tumnus impatiently. All we need is some pretext for going down to our ship today and taking things on board. Yes, said Edmund doubtfully. Well then, said the fawn, how would it be if your majesties invited the prince to a great banquet that is to be held aboard our royal ship, the Splendor Hyaline, tomorrow night? And let the message be worded as graciously as the queen can contrive it without pledging her honor, so as to give the prince a hope that she is weakening. This is very good counsel, sire, croaked the raven. And then, continued Tumnus excitedly, everyone will expect us to be going down to the ship all day, making preparations for our guests. And let some of us go to the bazaars and spend every coin we have at the fruiterers and the sweetmeat sellers and the wine merchants, just as if we were really going to have a feast. And let us order magicians and jugglers and dancing girls and flute players and invite them all to come on board tomorrow night. I see, said Edmund, rubbing his hands. And then, said Tumnus, we shall all be on board tonight, and as soon as it is quite dark, up sails and out oars, said the king. And out to sea, cried Tumnus, leaping up and beginning to dance. And setting out toward the north, said the first dwarf. Running for home, hurrah for Narnia and the north, said the other. And the prince, waking next morning and finding his bird has flown, said Paradan, clapping his hand. Oh, Master Tumnus, dear Master Tumnus, said the queen, catching his hand and swinging him as they danced. You have saved us all. Here's Susan and Mr. Tumnus, and you can see the raven in the background there. It looks like a peacock standing beside him, doesn't it? You have saved us all. The prince will chase us, said another lord, whose name Shasta had not heard. Well, that is the least of my fears, said Edmund. I have seen all the ships in the river, and there's not a tall ship or a warship or a swift galley there. Yeah, I wish he would chase us, for the splendor Hyaline could sink anything he has to send after her, if we were overtaken at all. Sire, said the raven, you shall hear no better plot than Mr. Tumnus's tonight, though we sat in council for 7 days. And now, as we birds say, nests before eggs, which is as much to say, let us all eat our food and then at once be about our business. Everyone arose at this, and the doors were opened, and the lords and the creatures stood aside for the king and the queen to go in first. Shasta wondered what he ought to do. But Mr. Tumnus said, you lie here, your highness, and I will bring you a little feast to yourself in a few moments. There's no need for you to move until we're all ready to go onto the ship. Shasta laid his head down again on the pillow, and soon he was alone in the room. This is perfectly dreadful, said Shasta. It never came into his head to tell these Narnians the whole truth and ask for their help. Having been brought up by a hard, close-fisted man like Arshish, he had a fixed habit of never telling grown-ups anything if he could help it. He thought they would always want to spoil or stop whatever it was you were going to do. And he thought that even if the Narnia king might be friendly to the 2 horses, he would hate Aravis because she was a Calormene, and he would either sell her for a slave or send her back to her father. And as for himself, he thought, I simply dare not tell them that I'm not Prince Corrin, thought Shasta, because I've heard all their plans. If they knew I wasn't one of themselves, they'd never let me out of this house alive. They'd be afraid I'd betray them to the Tisrock. They'll kill me. And if the real Corrin turns up, it'll all come out and they will kill me. He had, you see, no idea of how noble and free-born people behave. What am I going to do? What am I to do? He kept saying to himself. Well, here comes this little goaty creature again. The fawn trotted in, half dancing, with a tray on his hands, which was nearly as large as a table itself, and this he set down beside Shasta's sofa, and sat himself down on the carpeted floor with his goaty legs crossed. Now, princeling, he said, make a good dinner. It will be your last meal in Tashbaan. It was a fine meal after the Kellerman fashion. I'll show you a picture of it. And here's his dinner. Maybe you can see melons and a lobster there and a flask at the back there with something to drink in it. All kinds of interesting stuff to eat, none of which we recognize. It was a fine meal after the Calormene fashion. I don't know whether you would have liked it or not, but Shasta did. There were lobsters and salad and snipe, which are kind of a seabird, snipe stuffed with almonds and truffles, and a complicated dish made of chicken livers and rice and raisins and nuts. And there were cool melons and gooseberry and mulberry desserts and every kind of nice things that can be made with ice. There was also a little flagon of the sort of wine that is called white, but it's really yellow. While Shasta was eating, the good little fawn, who thought he was still dazed with sunstroke, kept talking to him about the fine times he would have when they got home. About his good old father, King Loon of Archenland, and the little castle where he lived on the southern slopes of the pass. And don't forget, said Mr. Tumnus, that you are promised your first suit of armor and your first war horse on your next birthday. And then your highness will learn how to tilt and joust, and in a few years, if all goes well, King Peter has promised your royal father that he himself will make you a knight at Cair Paravel. And in the meantime, there will be plenty of comings and goings between Narnia and Archenland, across the mountains. And of course, you remember that you have promised to come for a whole week to stay with us for the summer festival. And there'll be bonfires and all-night dances of fauns and dryads in the heart of the woods. And who knows, we might see Aslan himself. When the meal was over, the fawn told Shasta to stay quietly where he was. And it wouldn't do you any harm to have a little sleep, he said. I'll call you in plenty of time to get on board the ship. And then home, Narnia, and the north. Shasta had so enjoyed his dinner and all the things that Tumnus had been telling him that when he was left alone, his thoughts took a different turn. He only hoped now that the real Prince Corrin would not turn up until it was too late, and that he would be taken away to Narnia by ship. I'm afraid he did not think at all about what might happen to the real Corrin when he was left behind in Tashbaan. He was a little worried about Aravis and Bree waiting for him at the tombs, but then he said to himself, well, I can't help it. And then, anyway, that Aravis thinks she's too good to go about with me, so she can jolly well go on alone. And then at the same time, he couldn't help feeling that it would be much nicer to go to Narnia by sea than toiling across the desert. When he had thought all this, he did what I expect you would have done if you had been up very early, had a long walk, a great deal of excitement, and then a very good meal, and you were lying on a sofa in a cool room with no noise in it, except when a bee came buzzing in through the wide-open windows. He fell asleep. What woke him was a loud crash. He jumped off the sofa, staring. He saw at once from the mere look of the room, the light and shadow all looked different, that he must have slept for several hours. He also saw what had made the crash. A costly porcelain vase that had been standing on the windowsill lay broken on the floor, broken into about 30 pieces. But he hardly noticed all these things. What he did notice was 2 hands gripping the windowsill from outside. They gripped harder and harder, getting white at the knuckles. And then up came a head and a pair of shoulders. A moment later, there was a boy of Shasta's own age sitting astride the sill with one leg hanging down into the room. There he is. I bet you can guess who it is. Shasta had never seen his own face in a looking glass. Even if he had, he might not have realized that the other boy at ordinary times looked almost exactly like himself. But at this moment, the boy was not particularly like anyone, for he had the finest black eye you've ever seen, and a tooth missing. And his clothes, which must have been splendid ones when he put them on, were torn and dirty, and there was blood and mud on his face. "Who are you?" said the boy in a whisper. "Are you Prince Corrin?" whispered Shasta back. "Yes, of course," said the other, "but who are you?" I'm nobody in particular," said Shasta. "King Edmund caught me in the street and mistook me for you. I suppose we must look like one another. Can I get out of the way now that you're in?" "Well, yes, if you're any good at climbing," said Corrin, "but why are you in such a hurry? I say we ought to be able to get some fun out of this, being mistaken for one another." No, said Shasta, "we must change places at once. It'll be simply frightful if Mr. Tumnus comes back and finds us both here. I've had to pretend to be you, and you are starting tonight secretly. And where have you been all this time?" "Well, a boy in the street made a beastly joke about Queen Susan," said Prince Corrin, "so I knocked him down. He ran howling into a house, and his big brother came out. So I knocked the big brother down. And then they all followed me until we ran into 3 old men with spears who called the watch. So I fought the watch, and they knocked me down. It was getting dark by now. Then the watch took me along to lock me up somewhere. So I asked them if they would like to stop for some wine, and they said they didn't mind if they did. So I took them to a wine shop and bought them some, and they all sat down and drank until they fell asleep. I thought it was time for me to be off, so I came out quietly, and then I found the first boy still hanging around, so I knocked him down again. And after that, I climbed up a pipe onto the roof of a house and lay quiet until it began to get light this morning, and ever since then, I've been finding my way back. I say, is there anything to drink?" "No, I drank it all," said Shasta. "And now show me how you got in. There's not a moment to lose. You'd better lie down on the sofa and pretend, but I forgot. It'll be no good with all those bruises and the black eye. You'll just have to tell them the truth once I'm safely away." What else did you think I'd be telling them?" said the prince with a rather angry look. "And who are you?" There's no time, said Shasta in a frantic whisper. I'm a Narnian, I believe, or something northern, but I've been brought up all my life in Calorman, and I'm escaping across the desert with a talking horse named Bree. And now, quick, how do I get away? Look, said Corrin, drop from this window onto the roof of the veranda. But mind you do it lightly, on your toes, or someone will hear you. Then go along to your left, and you can get up onto the top of that wall there, if you're any good at all as a climber. And then run along the wall until you get to the corner. Drop down onto the rubbish heap you'll find outside, and there you are. Thanks, said Shasta, who was already sitting on the windowsill. The two boys were looking into each other's faces, and then suddenly found that they were friends. Goodbye, said Corrin, and good luck. I do hope you get safe away. Goodbye, said Shasta. I say, you have been having some adventures. Nothing to yours, said the prince. Now drop. Lightly, I say, he added, as Shasta dropped. I hope we meet in Archenland. Go to my father, King Loon, and tell him you're a friend of mine. Look out, I hear someone coming. That is the end of chapter 5. Whoa. All right, let's have a look at chapter 6, Shasta Among the Tombs. Shasta ran lightly along the roof on tiptoes. It felt so hot to his bare feet. He was only a few seconds scrambling up the wall at the far end, and when he got to the corner, he found himself looking down into a narrow, smelly street, and there was a rubbish heap up against the wall, just like Corrin had told him. Before jumping down, he had a rapid glance around him to get his bearings. Apparently, he had now come over the top of the island hill on which Tashbaan is built. Everything sloped away from him. Flat roofs below flat roofs, down to the towers and battlements of the city's northern wall. Beyond that was the river, and beyond the river, a short slope covered with gardens. But beyond that, there was something that he had never seen before, something gray and yellowish gray and great flat as a calm sea, stretching for miles. And on the far side of it were huge blue, lumpy things with jagged edges, some of them with white tops. The desert, the mountains, thought Shasta. He jumped down onto the rubbish and began trotting along downhill as fast as he could in the narrow lane, which soon brought him into a wider street where there were more people. No one bothered to look at a little ragged boy running along on bare feet. Still, he was anxious and uneasy until he turned a corner, and there he saw the city gate in front of him. Here he was pressed and jostled a bit, for a good many other people were also going out. And on the bridge beyond the gate, the crowd became quite a slow procession. Once out there, with clear running water on each side, it was deliciously fresh after the smell and the heat and the noise of Tashbaan. Once Shasta reached the far end of the bridge, he found the crowd melting away. Everyone seemed to be going either to the left or to the right along the riverbank. He went straight ahead, up a road that did not appear to be much used, and it went between gardens. And in a few paces, he was completely alone, and a few more paces brought him to the top of a slope. There he stood and stared. It was like coming to the end of the world, for the grass stopped quite suddenly a few feet in front of him, and the sand became an endless, level sand sea, but rougher than at the seashore because it was never wet. The mountains, which now looked further off than before, loomed ahead, and greatly to his relief he saw, about 5 minutes' walk away, what must certainly be the tombs, just as Bree had described them. Great masses of moldering stone shaped like gigantic beehives, but a little narrower. They looked very black and grim, for the sun was now setting behind them. He turned his face west and trotted toward the tombs. He couldn't help looking out very hard for any signs of his friends, though the setting sun shone in his face so he could hardly see anything. And anyway, he thought, of course, they'll be around on the far side of the tombs, not on this side where anyone might see them from the city. Here's a picture. Shasta looking at the tombs and the mountains way behind him, and sand stretching in every direction. There were about 12 tombs, each with a low arched doorway that opened into absolute blackness. They were dotted about in no certain kind of order, so that it took a long time going around one and going around that one before you could be sure that you had looked around the side of every single tomb. And this was what Shasta had to do. And there was nobody there. It was very quiet out here on the edge of the desert, and now the sun had really set. Suddenly, from somewhere behind him, there came a terrible sound. Shasta's heart gave a great jump, and he had to bite his tongue to keep from screaming. Next moment, he realized what it was. It was the horns of Tashbaan blowing for the closing of the gates. "Don't be a silly little coward," he said to himself. "It's only the same noise you heard this morning." But there's a great difference between a noise letting you in with your friends in the morning and a noise heard alone at nightfall shutting you out. And now that the gates were shut, he knew that there was no chance of the others joining him that evening. Either they're shut up in Tashbaan for the night, he thought, or else they've gone on without me. It's just the sort of thing Aravis would do. But Bree wouldn't. Oh, he wouldn't now, would he? But in this idea about Aravis, Shasta was once more quite wrong. She was proud, and she could be hard enough, it's true. But she was as true as steel, and she would never have deserted a companion, whether she liked him or not. Now that Shasta knew he would have to spend the night alone, it was getting darker every minute. He began to like the look of the place less and less. There was something very uncomfortable about those great silent shapes of stone. He had been trying for the hardest time not to think about ghosts, but he couldn't help it any longer. Oh, help!" he shouted suddenly, for at that very moment he felt something touch his leg. I don't think anyone can be blamed for shouting if something comes up behind them at such a place and such a time when he's frightened already. Shasta, at any rate, was too frightened to run. Anything would be better than being chased around and around the burial place of the ancient kings with something that he dared not look at behind him. Instead, he did what was really the most sensible thing he could do. He looked around, and his heart almost burst with relief. What had touched him was only a cat. The light was too bad now for Shasta to see much of the cat, except that it was very big and very solemn. It looked as if it might have lived for a long, long time among the tombs. Its eyes made you think it knew secrets that it would not tell. "Puss, puss," said Shasta. "I don't suppose you're a talking cat, are you?" The cat stared at him harder than ever, and then it started walking away. And of course Shasta followed it. It led him right through the tombs and out on the desert side of them. There it sat down, bolt upright, with its tail curled around its feet, and its face set toward the desert and toward Narnia and the north, as if it were watching for some enemy. Shasta lay down beside it, with his back against his cat and the face toward the tombs. Because if one is nervous about something, there's nothing like having your face toward the danger and having something nice and warm and solid at your back. The sand wouldn't have been very comfortable to you, but Shasta had been sleeping on the ground for weeks and he hardly noticed it. Very soon, he fell asleep, though even in his dreams, he kept on wondering what had happened to Bree and Aravis and Wynne. He was wakened suddenly by a noise he had never heard before. Perhaps it's only a nightmare, he thought to himself. But at the same moment, he noticed that the cat was gone from his back, and he wished it hadn't. But he lay quite still, without even opening his eyes, because he felt sure that he would be more frightened if he did sit up and look around at the tombs in their loneliness, just as you or I might lie with the bedclothes over our heads. But then a noise came again, a harsh, piercing cry behind him out in the desert. And then, of course, he had to open his eyes and sit up. The moon was shining brightly. The tombs, looking far bigger and nearer than he thought they would be, were gray in the moonlight. In fact, they looked horribly like huge people, draped in gray robes that covered their heads and faces. They were not at all nice things to have near you when spending the night alone in a strange place. But the noise had come from the opposite side, from the desert. Shasta had to turn his back on the tombs, and he didn't like that much, and stare out across the level sand, and the wild cry sang out again. I hope it's not more lions, thought Shasta. It was in fact not very like the lion's roars he had heard on the night when he met Hwin and Aravis. It was really the cry of a jackal. But of course, Shasta didn't know that. Even if he had known, he wouldn't have very much wanted to meet a jackal. The cries rang out again and again. There's more than one of them, wherever they are, and whatever they are, thought Shasta, and it sounds like they're coming nearer. I suppose that if he had been an entirely sensible boy, he would have gone back through the tombs, nearer to the river where there were houses, and wild beasts would be less likely to come. But then there were, or he thought there were, ghosts. To go back through the tombs would mean going back past those dark openings in the tombs, and what might come out of them. It may have been silly, but Shasta felt that he would rather risk the wild animals. But then, as the sounds of those cries came nearer and nearer, he began to change his mind. He was just going to run for it, when suddenly, between him and the desert, a huge animal bounded into view. As the moon was behind it, it looked quite black, and Shasta didn't know what it was, except that it had a very big, shaggy head, and it had 4 legs. It did not seem to have noticed Shasta, but it suddenly turned its head toward the desert, and let out a roar which re-echoed through the tombs and seemed to shake the sand under Shasta's feet. The cries of the other creatures suddenly stopped, and he thought he could hear their feet scampering away. Then the great beast turned and examined Shasta. It's a lion, I know it's a lion, thought Shasta. I'm done. I wonder if it will hurt much. I wish it was over. I wonder, does anything happen to people after they're dead? Ooh, here he comes. And he shut his eyes and clenched his teeth. But instead of teeth and claws, he only felt something warm lying on his feet. And when he opened his eyes, he said, That's not nearly as big as I thought. It's only half the size. No, it isn't even a quarter of the size. Look, it's only the cat. I must have dreamed all that about its being big as a horse. And whether he had been really dreaming or not, what was now lying at his feet and staring at him with his big, green, unwinking eyes was the cat, although it was certainly one of the largest cats he had ever seen. Oh, kitty cat, gasped Shasta. I am so glad to see you again. I was having such horrible dreams. And he lay down once again, with his back to the cat, as it had been at the beginning of the night, and the warmth from the cat spread all over him. I will never do anything nasty to a cat again as long as I live, said Shasta, half to the cat and half to himself. I did once, you know. I threw stones at a half-starved, mangy old cat. Hey, stop that! For the cat had turned around him and given him a scratch. None of that, said Shasta. It isn't as if you could understand what I'm saying. And then he dozed off. Next morning, when he woke, the cat was gone. The sun was already up, and the sand was hot. Shasta was very thirsty. He sat up and rubbed his eyes. The desert was blindingly white, and there was a murmur of voices from the city behind him. Where he sat, though, everything was perfectly still. When he looked a little left and west so that the sun was not in his eyes, he could see the mountains on the far side of the desert, so sharp and clear that they looked only a stone's throw away. He particularly noticed one blue height that divided into 2 peaks at the top, and he decided that that must be Mount Pyre. So that's our direction, judging by what the raven said, he thought. So I'll just make sure of it, so as not to waste any time when the others showed up. So he made a good, deep, straight furrow with his foot, pointing exactly at Mount Pyre. The next job, clearly, was to get something to eat and drink. Shasta trotted back through the tombs. They looked quite ordinary now, and he wondered how he ever could have been afraid of them. And he went down into the cultivated land by the riverside. There were a few people about, but not many, for the city gates had been open for several hours, and the early morning crowds had already gone in. So he had no difficulty in doing a little raiding, as Bree had called it. It involved a climb over a garden wall, and the results were 3 oranges, a melon, a fig or two, and a pomegranate. After that, he went down to the river bank, but not too near the bridge, and had a drink. The water was so nice that he took off his hot, dirty clothes and had a dip. For, of course, Shasta had lived at the shore all his life and had learned to swim almost as soon as he had learned to walk. And when he came out, he lay on the grass looking across the water at Tashbaan, all the splendor and strength and glory of it. But that made him remember the dangers of it, too. He suddenly realized that the others might have reached the tombs by now while he was bathing. "I'd gone on without me as likely as not," he thought. So he dressed in a fright and tore back at such speed that he was all hot and thirsty when he arrived, and so the good of his bathe was gone. Like most days when you're alone and waiting for something, this day seemed to be about 100 hours long. He had plenty to think about, of course, but sitting alone, just thinking, is pretty slow. He thought a great deal about the Narnians, and especially about Corrin. He wondered what had happened when they discovered the boy who had been lying on the sofa and hearing all their secret plans wasn't really Corrin at all. It was very unpleasant to think of all those nice people thinking that he was a traitor. But as the sun slowly climbed up to the top of the sky and then slowly began to go down in the west, and no one came and nothing at all happened, he began to get more and more anxious. And of course now he realized that when they arranged to meet one another at the tombs, no one had said anything about how long. He couldn't wait there for the rest of his life. And soon it would be dark again, and he'd have another night just like last night. A dozen different plans went through his head, all wretched ones, and at last he fixed on the worst plan of all. He decided to wait until it was dark, and then go back to the river and steal as many melons as he could, and then set out for Mount Pyre alone, trusting for his directions to the line he had drawn that morning in the sand. It was a crazy idea, and if you have read as many books as you have about journeying over deserts, if he had read as many books as you have about journeying over deserts, he never would have dreamed it. But Shasta had read no books at all. But before the sun set, something did happen. Shasta was sitting in the shadow of one of the tombs when he looked up and saw 2 horses coming toward him. Then his heart gave a great leap, for he recognized them as Bree and Hwin. But the next moment, his heart went down to his toes again, for there was no sign of Aravis. The horses were being led by a strange man, an armed man, pretty handsomely dressed, like an upper slave in a great family. Bree and Hwin were no longer gotten up like pack horses, but they were saddled and bridled. What could all this mean? It's a trap, thought Shasta. Somebody has caught Aravis, and perhaps they've tortured her, and she's given the whole thing away, and they want me to jump out and run up and speak to Bree, and then I'll be caught too. And yet if I don't, I'm losing my only chance to meet the others. I do wish I knew what had happened. And he skulked behind the tomb, looking at every few minutes and wondering what was the least dangerous thing to do. And we are going to have to wait until next time to find out what that least dangerous thing to do is. This is an exciting book, isn't it? So next time we'll read chapters 7 and 8. And in the meantime, bye for now, and it's been lovely to be with you.